But now to the business of the day, and without further ado, I call to the podium our Chair of the Day, Bob Glindemann, to take over today's meeting and introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, President Adrian. I'm going to use the Chairman's privilege to say Larry has mentioned Rotary Foundation. November is Rotary Foundation Month, and if I don't mention Rotary Foundation Month, my good colleague Sue McCarthy will come and cut my throat, because you full well know, those of you that aren't Centurion members or contributors to Rotary Foundation, you'll be hounded to make sure that you are before the end of November. So Sue will have all the paperwork next week and the following week and the week after that to make sure that we have 100% support to the foundation, because you can see the wonderful things that it does. Now, my task today is to introduce our guest speaker, and it's always nice to have one of our own as the guest speaker, and that's Philip Cornish. Philip has had a long career in government and public service, and decided that the time was right to move into the charity area, that he was the interim CEO of Missions to Seamen, or Seafarers. And I was talking to Philip before lunch. He tells me that he's actually the past interim CEO, because they now have appointed a CEO for Mission to Seafarers. Most of you are aware of the Mission to Seafarers, and I'm sure Philip will give it to you in far more detail when he comes to the podium. But it's an international mission of the Anglican Church that cares for the practical and spiritual welfare of seafarers of all nationalities and faiths. And over these last couple of years, there have been some quite challenges that those various seafarers have faced all around the world, and I'm sure Philip will touch on that as he speaks to you. So, Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Well, it's a total Rotarian program today, which can't be a totally bad thing. I talked when I started a job as interim CEO at the Mission to Seafarers, but I was looking after Melbourne's best kept secret in plain sight. Those of you who might know the building, it's the end of Flinders Street. It was built in 1917. It has a dome. It's in a Spanish mission style. It looks totally institutional. And whenever I talk to people about where I was working, I'd always say, I've always wondered what happened in that building. Well, can I tell you, nothing nefarious, be that good or bad, happens in that building, but hopefully a lot of good work. So the Mission to Seafarers has been in Melbourne since 1857, during that initial great gold rush period that basically built this big city. And we started off as a shipping hulk, somewhere over there on the shores of Port Phillip Bay, between Hobson's Bay and Williamstown. And initially we had two of them on the bay. We had one at Williamstown, which was actually for many years the busier port than the Port of Melbourne, and one down in the Port of Melbourne. So we consolidated those and made ourselves into one centre. And of course, we're on Crown land, we're a church agency, so no decisions happen quickly. And I think that's the only basis on which we're still standing there today. So Bob mentioned in passing some of the difficulties that people have had with the seafarers in the last couple of years. COVID was tough on all of us. COVID was particularly tough on the seafarers. And we use the term seafarers now rather than merchant navy or sailors, because there are an increasing number of women who are working on board, but a very small number of women. It's only about 2%. So Australia is a signatory to the Maritime Labour Convention, as basically all countries are, but we suspended our obligations in part during COVID for that Maritime Labour Convention and kept people on ships. So for 2 years, people were not off ports anywhere basically in the world. And as some of you know, where there are ships out at sea waiting for a port dock, which would be happening in the Black Sea at the moment, or for some of those ships with iron ore or coal trying to get into China, the sailors are kept on. Now, we had a very strong Ukrainian captain who was insistent earlier this year that his seafarers could get off the ship. So at his assistance, we actually started, our first crew was visiting. Now we've got a number of aims. We really pick people up from the port, bring them to our institution, which is basically a bar, a club, and they have a setting. Now, because there are some 200 around the world, or 240, depending on how you count, Mission to Seafarers, we're well known to the sailors, and they're often what they call flying angel clubs, which is the sort of social club that goes with it. There are a similar number of Stella Marises, which is Roman Catholic mission. There are a number in the Baltic, which are Lutheran, and in North America, there are a number of non-denominational Christian. They all provide much the same sorts of services. Now, the first two sailors we had allowed off onshore were both, as it happens, Ukrainian sailors. I can't say that they looked terribly happy, but they certainly looked relieved to be on ground. But every now and again we get a crew who have only recently been allowed offshore. So we always know who they are because they tend to take selfies with old men like me in the bar. They take photos of all the memorials, but if you've been isolated on ship for 3 years, like we had recently for a crew, you tend to get very excited in being allowed off. So Australia is now working to achieve all of its obligations under the Maritime Labour Convention. So respite onshore is one of those. We work quite closely with AMSA, the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. Every time you work in a new sector, you find a new acronym or two. So that's one of the ones we work on. And one of their obligations is to make sure that international seafarers are looked after. And they bring to our attention and we bring to their attention when that's not happening. We work quite closely with them and the International Transport Federation as well. We have about 5 aims which are in our constitutional: spiritual, emotional, moral and physical. That dome is not a place of worship. That dome was originally built as a gymnasium. The reason it's got that domed roof is for the different rope lengths for the sailors. Of course, in 1917, when they were built, it was basically still sail. And so the men were here in ship for 2 or 3 weeks sometimes, and so they needed activities to keep themselves fit and occupied. We would say the moral obligation was to try and keep the guys out of mischief. Well, they're only here in port now for a number of hours. The days of being in port for a long time to get into mischief have well truly gone. Since containerisation and roll on, roll off in the late 60s, early 70s, sailors are often here only for a number of hours. The number of crewmen operating those big, enormous ships, probably 20 to 30 people. It's still a dangerous place, but they literally will have one session off the ship. So what tends to happen is they tend to come to us, they might have a beer, they might order a pizza, because one of the things you can't do in the middle of the sea is order a pizza. And I even had somebody who was the cook on a ship, and I know that because he had cook written across him, having a pizza, and I accused him of lashing out, and he said, well, I need a break too. About 40% of international seafarers are Filipinos. In this region, it's probably a little bit higher. So one of the great delights we do have is that our full-time chaplain is from a Filipino background. So his language skills are absolutely critical. And our part-time chaplain is from a Burmese-speaking background. Burma is a much smaller group of sailors, but nonetheless quite important. There tends to be not a lot of moralising. What we tend to find is they come to us, they then go shopping, because if you haven't, contract length is about 10 to 12 months on an international ship. Most of their income actually goes to the family at home, but they do have cash which is dispensed in US dollars normally, and so they go out and buy some shopping, because I think most of us agree that a few treats and a bottle of good perfume is the least that you can have for looking after the family for 10 to 12 months by yourself. And it's actually a very important source of income. I'm glad to say that the number of people who are being confined on ship has reduced markedly. Now, even though I talk about us being the world's best kept secret in plain sight, I have had a number of radio interviews in the last 6 months. So Neil, who has taken over from me this week, much better qualified than I am, will have that opportunity. But some of you may have heard me on 3AW. Please put up your hand. No. Yes, here we are. When our weather vane, our beautiful copper and lead weather vane, was stolen from the roof. So one of our patrons put up a reward. The only good thing to happen out of that really was that we had some good publicity for the mission, but it did mean that I had a number of interviews. The last time I was interviewed on a radio was when I was in the public sector, when of course your object as a public servant is to kill the story, which, given it was on elevated levels of Legionella bacteria in the water source, wasn't hard to do. So not one call came in, but lots came in on the other ones. Now, our little chapel does have people come in and visit it. And every now and again we get someone coming in because they want to see the chapel where Grandma and Granddad got married. And Grandma was one of the people who came to dance with the sailors when they were in port at the dances we used to run, and they ended up getting married in the chapel. So that's very important. In fact, one of our parishioners of a church I go to remembered with some fondness the opportunities to dance in the 50s when she was a boarder at Merton Hall, Melbourne Church of England Grammar School, and they were bussed down to help dance with the sailors. Remember, they didn't have TV in those days. And she still, though, remembered the line being used by a Brazilian sailor on one of those evenings when he said to her that she needed to come to Brazil where the moon is full every night and love is always in the air. Nearly 70 years later, she was still chuckling about that line. Heather didn't go, like any sensible schoolgirl. But it is extraordinary how many people have had some contact with the mission. In fact, we had one of the people beforehand came up and talked to me. Has anyone got a family association with the mission at all, or associated? Yeah, a couple. Yes. So 60,000 sailors still visit this port every year. Used to be more when those smaller ships, and about 10% used to come to us. We're still building up numbers. Now, a lot of our trade is point to point. You go from us to China and back. China has even more strict COVID restrictions than us, and so some of the sailors are actually reluctant to come off on shore, because if there's any hint of COVID on the ship, they get restricted for months on shore. So they tend to sort of self-quarantine, particularly if they're close to the end of a contract. So that's a major issue. Chinese sailors tend not to come off ships in any case, and are paid in yuan, as opposed to most other sailors who are paid in the global currency, US dollars. So that's one of the things that we do. When we started here, we were obviously a very small organisation. But one of the groups that supported us over the years was a ladies' guild called the Harbour Lights Guild. And those were the ladies who actually built the building we're in at the moment. It was their fundraising. They built the gymnasium when they thought the guys needed somewhere to exercise. They were the ones who ran the dances, and they were the ones who built our beautiful little chapel, which for people who are into architecture, it's the same architects as built the chapel in Bishop's Court. And they must have been an extraordinary group. They were an all-age group, from children to much older ladies. But remember, when we were built in 1917, there was still a lot of conflict in the world. It is the only place I have ever worked or been responsible for where we have a gun safe. So you might wonder, why would we have a gun safe? Well, of course, in the old days, 1917, there was still a world war going and there were still raiders making attack on Australian ships. And there are still pirates currently. There are still, we think, about 2 to 250 people killed a year who are sailors by pirates internationally on waters. So it's still an issue. We don't use the gun safe now for anything else other than post-it notes. Post-it notes in the hands of a wrong facilitator can be very dangerous, as we know. So we keep them under lock and key. Now, we tend to think that pirates are sort of something for an excuse for going, wearing a funny hat and some strong rum punch, but it is actually quite serious. Albeit, one of the events that we hire the facility out for at the moment is a pirate show, which is a burlesque show. They don't use parliamentary language, and they certainly don't use language that would be suitable for general exhibition, but it is a lot of fun, and they've been great supporters of us. But for me, it's an opportunity just to flag with people that it is a serious risk to these seafarers. 80% of basically all of what we consume in Australia is brought in by a seafarer. That crockery, that cutlery, the coffee, most importantly for us in Melbourne, all comes by an international seafarer, and we shouldn't forget the debt that we owe them. World War II, of course, there were, depending on how you count it, 40 to 70 ships sunk around Australia that were Australian flagged. We forget that, including ships torpedoed in the Bass Strait. So it came very close to home to this country. So there were thousands of maritime seafarers killed in war to keep things going. Now, in the Black Sea, of course, there's incidents going on in relation to grain trade. The Russian and Ukrainian sailors we see locally tend to get on very well. Although they're the only, I shouldn't make overgeneralisations, but they're the only group that come into our mission at 10 o'clock in the morning and have a vodka starter before going off to do their shopping for family and friends. The Filipinos tend to have a beer later in the day, but the Russians and Ukrainians, who get on quite well here, have a different habit. In the Black Sea, I understand those tensions are boiling over in some of those mixed crews. So you'd sort of expect that sort of thing to happen. Now, if you've got the opportunity to come and visit us, please do so. The bar is actually part of a way that we subsidise ourselves. We don't receive government funding, albeit we help the government achieve its obligations under the Maritime Labour Convention, and we feel that we should have some funding. So it's our social events. Even if you're married, get married again, hold a wedding reception with us, do a renewal of vows, we'd appreciate it. So Bob has 1 foot on the stage and I'll step off now. Thank you.
Don't go away, Philip. You can't go off. You know that we're going to have some questions. We've got a few moments for questions. If you've got a question, you know the drill. Put your hand up. The microphone will come across. State your name. Clearly ask the question and Philip will give you the answer. Jim. Oops.
It's not one of the seafarers.
Obviously a vodka starter. Thanks, Philip. I think you mentioned that the seafarers have a 18-month contract?
10 months.
10-month contract. Do you have a sense of how many of them do multiple contracts and how much time they would spend at home between contracts? And perhaps also, my understanding is that Filipinos make up a lot of the crew, but then the sort of officers, there's a captain and maybe a couple of officers on each ship. What's the sort of ethnic mix of those perhaps? Is it Filipino or something else?
What tends to happen is there's a 3-month break in contracts. So people go back to home and stay for 3 months, paid, and then pick up another contract. They're very reluctant to make too much trouble because obviously your next contract depends on it. In relation to the officers, they're a mixed bag. Tends to be a lot of Eastern European, so Romanian, Russian, Ukrainian. I've got to say the women seafarers I've seen have tended to be officers, first mate, second mate, third mate, and sometimes stewards. Different background. The largest group of female seafarers that I can recall seeing were brought by the captain's wife. Some of the captains bring their spouses on board, and it was an Indian crewed ship, and they had 6 female seafarers. Normally it's only 1 or 2. So that was quite different. I understand in Mediterranean waters it's slightly different because trips tend to be slightly shorter hops, contracts are slightly shorter, and it's a bit easier to combine family responsibilities with that sort of mix. But yeah, it's different.
It's all right, the pianist drunk.
I visited the mission. It's a lovely building. It
Yes.
needs a lot of work on it.
That's a lot of work.
Right alongside there on the Yarra, the South Wharf residential project is going ahead.
Yep.
So-called heritage project where they've pulled down most of the South Wharf anyway. They use you in their marketing. Do you get $1 from them?
They generously help sponsor our art prize, but no, nothing else at this stage. Just in terms of how we're orientated, we face out towards now all of those shiny big towers of capitalism, but in the old days that was where the goods sheds were, that was where the carpenters, the shipwrights, the little businesses and the sailors' homes were all on that side. So we actually faced where the action is. The 3 parts of a heritage really in the maritime, we're on the Green Line, and I complained to Sally Cat when I accidentally sat next to her at a forum. She must always have, our Lord Mayor, she must always have people complaining to her, was that why were they starting at the other end? Well, they're keen for some private investment to do it with us. But you've got Polly Woodside, ourselves, and then the old goods sheds are the 3 remaining maritime heritage in that area, and arguably it's a disgrace we didn't allow more of it to survive. We rattle around a bit, we don't need as big a place as we've got, so it's still a moot point as to what we'll do.
Thank you, Philip, for a very entertaining and informative talk. You mentioned that your chaplain speaks Filipino, but I imagine a lot of other visitors are from other parts of the world. And given that you're trying to help them in terms of their mental health and socializing and so on, how do you get over the language barriers that exist?
We find that English tends to be a very international language on the sea still. But look, 4 out of 5 ships that we see would be Filipino crewed, I think. The English crews, the old days of coastal sailors manned by Australians on the ships have long gone. We've only got 11 to 13 flagged Australian ships, which of course began to look to be a very serious problem during COVID because we weren't able to sustain our trade. But we find English is good, but we'll find someone who can speak the language as a rule. And of course, the Ukrainians whose ports have been destroyed by shelling, their towns, really don't know what we're going to. Most of their families are now in Eastern Europe, and when their contracts finish, they go there. But you know, ships are a dangerous workplace. They're on a hard industrial equipment on a moving platform, and occasionally we get people who have parts of their limbs lopped off by equipment that we help to look after and repatriate. So it is an issue. Yep.
Thank you, Philip. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. And oh, Mary, I beg your pardon.
Oh.
Mary has a question, quick.
Yeah, well, this will be the best save till last, Mary, I bet.
Well, thank you very much, Bob and Philip. My question is, we hear about flagged and unflagged ships, and you've mentioned flagged a few times. Are there a huge difference in the conditions on both types of ships, and which one is predominant at the moment?
Huge difference in conditions. Some people would argue that the Australian Maritime Union of Australia has actually done itself out of a job because conditions are so good for Australian sailors. I'm not sure that's true, but certainly compared to other crewed ships, they run at a loss. So the conditions are quite substantially different. Virtually, look, there are thousands of Australian ships come to Australia and 11 are Australian flagged. They tend to be iron ore companies who have bulk carriers that want to have control themselves, BHP, etc., but very few little. But in parts of Australia, you still need coastal shipping. Like in Western Australia, there is no rail link north. The roads are still not fantastic. You need it to go up and down. So, and look, there are Mission to Seafarers and Stella Maris all around Australia. Some are only with volunteers, but yeah, it's an issue for us. It's a great danger. I mean, essentially, you've got people from third world countries providing a service to the first world with lots of opportunities for exploitation.
Thank you, Philip. It's an interesting topic because, as Philip says, without the ships, we're in all sorts of trouble. And without the people that crew them, we're in even more trouble. So thank you very much, Philip, for it. Don't go away, don't go away, don't go away. Come on. We always have to give somebody a gift, and you know what the gift is. It's those Rotary, it's the convention socks, isn't it? Not the centenary socks now.
I'll wear them to the next board meeting.
Manufactured by our own Philip Industry in Preston. 100% Australian made. Philip, thank you very much. Brings us to the end of our meeting. Thank you everybody for attending today. Thanks to our MC Dasson and Mary for your reflection at the start, and to the crew that set the place up to make sure we can have this lunch. If you can help afterwards to close the place up, if you would, that'd be very helpful. A reminder for next week is the evening meeting at the Lyceum Club, and the specialist speaker will be a little bit different to this week. Artificial intelligence expert, Dr. Genevieve Hayes, and the topic will be emerging technologies and the future of business. Pretty timely given all those digital incidents we've just had in these last few weeks. We hope that you can join us. We close the meeting now with the National Anthem.